It was one of those languid Sunday afternoons in a suburban neighborhood, the kind of day where nothing out of the ordinary seemed likely to happen. The sun cast a warm glow over the streets, and the distant hum of lawnmowers, the sound of children playing, carried on the air. Leading from one corner of the neighborhood was Mrs. Agnes, a highly esteemed elderly lady reputed for her unmatchable benevolent nature towards stray animals. She had recently adopted a rescue dog now christened Rex, a German Shepherd, a breed that had an aura of alertness and discipline written all over it, though to most people, he was just her new loyal companion. Mrs. Agnes adored Rex, fussing over him as if he were her own child. She had no idea of the dog's history, only that he was a good boy who had landed at the rescue center. Unbeknownst to her, Rex had quite the storied past. He was police-trained, active on the force with his handler, and once a well-respected K-9 officer. Life had taken a different turn after his handler retired, and Rex had somehow ended up in the rescue system. Yet the discipline, the sharp instincts, the training, it was all still there, just beneath the surface. It was one of those days that started like any other, but things were about to change. Behind Mrs. Agnes' house, two men were crouched in the alley, peering through a gap in the fence. They were small-time crooks, always looking for an easy score. Lenny, the taller of the two, nudged Gary, pointing at the back door of Mrs. Agnes' house. "Look at that," Lenny whispered, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "The old lattice gone inside, and that mutt's just lying there. Piece of cake." Gary squinted, looking over at Rex, who was lounging in the sun, half asleep. "You sure about this, Lenny? That dog looks kinda big." Lenny laughed, shaking his head. "Big, yeah, but he's just a dumb mutt. Old Lattice probably been feeding him scraps. He won't be any trouble. Besides, there's gotta be something worth taking in there. Jewelry, cash, whatever." Gary hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. He wasn't the smartest guy, but he had a feeling about this dog. Still, he wasn't about to back down and let Lenny think he was scared. All right. Let's do it." They crept around the side of the house, moving quietly so as not to draw any attention. Lenny reached the back door first, testing the handle. It was unlocked. He grinned, turning to Gary. "See? Easy." They slipped inside, and the door closed softly behind them. The house was quiet except for the rhythmic tick of a clock. Gary's heart was pounding in his chest, and his eyes darted around. "We gotta be quick," he muttered. "Don't want to get caught." Lenny rolled his eyes, waving him off. "Relax. The old bat probably won't even notice we're here." He moved on into the living room, eyes scanning for what was valuable in here. Gary followed, glancing nervously toward the hallway. Meanwhile, outside, Rex's ears cocked upwards. Eyes that appeared half-closed a moment before became keen and sharp. He raised his head, sniffing the air. Something was amiss. The lazy attitude was in a trice replaced by an alertness. Rex stood up, staring at the back door. Silently, he went towards it, low and tensed, every muscle waiting to spring into action. Inside, Lenny had found Mrs. Agnes' jewelry box on a side table. He opened it, and a grin spread across his face at the sight of the glint of gold and silver. "Jackpot," he whispered, gesturing for Gary to approach him. "Look at this." Gary looked at the jewelry, then back at the hallway. Yeah, great. Just take it and go." Lenny snorted, shaking his head. "Always so jumpy. Relax, will ya?" He pocketed one necklace, his fingers brushing against a pair of earrings when suddenly, a low menacing growl echoed through the room. Both men froze, their heads snapping towards the sound. There, in the doorway, stood Rex, his teeth bared and a deep growl rumbling from his chest. His eyes were locked on them, and it was real clear this wasn't any ordinary house pet. Gary's face went pale, and his voice was trembling as he whispered, Lenny? I think we got a problem." Lenny turned slowly, his eyes wide as he took in the sight of the dog. He forced a laugh, hoping to hide his fear. "What, that mutt? He's just trying to scare us. Stand your ground." Rex took another step closer, his growl deeper now, his stare cold and hard. Gary swallowed hard, his hands trembling. I don't think he's bluffing, Lenny. We should get out of here. But Lenny, ever the cocky one, puffed out his chest. Nah, he's all bark. Watch this. He took a step closer to Rex, raising his voice. Get out of here, you stupid dog. Immediately, Rex responded. He sprang forward, his deep bark reverberating through the house as he charged at Lenny. In one swift move, Lenny had been sent backward, flailing his arms as he tripped on the coffee table and crashed to the floor with a loud thud. Gary yelped, scrambling to get out of the way, catching his foot on the rug and diving face first into an armchair. Lenny tried to rise, but Rex was on him, teeth mere inches from Lenny's face, low growls rolling deep within his throat. Panic swept aside all of the bravado in one instant, as if it had never existed. Okay. I'm sorry! He shrieked, his voice breaking. Call off the dog. Gary couldn't extricate himself from the armchair. His eyes wide with fear, he looked sideways at his partner. I told you it was a bad idea. Mrs. Agnes appeared in the hall, her eyes wide with horror at the scene before her. Lenny pinned on the floor, Gary tangled in the armchair, Rex standing over them, growling menacingly and unrelenting. Rex! Heel! She commanded, firm. He faltered, then retreated further, his eyes never leaving the intruders. Mrs. Agnes stepped across the room, her face transforming from a picture of shock to anger. What on earth do you think you're doing in my house? She huffed out, her hands on her hips. Lenny scrambled to his feet, his face flushed. We were just leaving, he stammered, backing toward the door. Finally, Gary managed to free himself, stumbling over to join Lenny as he made for the door, his eyes never leaving Rex. Mrs. Agnes just shook her head. Her tone was thick with disdain. Breaking into an old lattice house. You ought to be ashamed of yourselves. Lenny opened his mouth to say something, but a sharp bark from Rex made him think better of it. He turned, almost tripping over his feet as he bolted for the door, Gary close behind. They flung the door open and ran out, disappearing down the street without so much as a backward glance. Mrs. Agnes watched them go, her lips pressed into a thin line. Turning to Rex, now calmly sitting by her side, his eyes still fixed at the door, she reached down, patting his head. Good boy, Rex. Good boy. He let out a soft huff, his tail in a slight wag. Mrs. Agnes smiled, her heart swelling with pride. She had always known there was something special about Rex, but today proved just how extraordinary he really was. He wasn't just a rescue dog, he was a hero, through and through. She got up and went over to the side table to pick up the jewelry box, putting it back in its place. As she did, she looked down at Rex, who was staring up at her with those alert, dedicated eyes. Well, I suppose we ought to call the police, let them know about those two. What do you think, Rex? With a soft bark, it was almost an agreement, Rex replied, and Mrs. Agnes laughed. All right then. Let's get this straightened out. And maybe later, we will get you a great big bone as a reward. The word bone made Rex's ears perk up, and he followed Mrs. Agnes to the phone, his tail in excited motion. Today had been quite an eventful day, but as far as Rex was concerned, he was only doing his job, watching over the person that gave him his second chance at life. Mrs. Agnes dialed the police. To her surprise, her fingers did not shake as she had thought they would. As she explained, Rex sat beside her, ears perked and alert. The officer listened attentively to the story before reassuring her that someone would be by shortly to take a statement. She thanked them and laid the phone down, blowing a sigh of relief. Well, Rex, it looks like we'll have some visitors, she crooned, giving the German shepherd a reassuring pat on his back. Rex huffed softly without taking his eyes off the door, almost in a dare to those intruders to come back. Soon, a police siren could be heard getting closer, and a patrol car appeared in front of Mrs. Agnes' house. Two officers emerged from the car, their postures reflected calmness, yet alertness. Mrs. Agnes opened the door before they could knock, with Rex right beside her, his posture relaxed but eyes still watchful. Afternoon, ma'am, one of the officers said to Mrs. Agnes with a polite nod. Officer Daniels, this is Officer Reyes. We're here about the break-in. Mrs. Agnes stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. Yes, thank you for coming so quickly. Please come in. The officers stepped inside, their eyes briefly scanning the room before landing on Rex. That's a fine-looking dog you've got there, Officer Reyes commented, and there was a touch of admiration in her voice. Mrs. Agnes smiled, her eyes softening as she looked down at Rex. He's more than that, he's a hero. If it weren't for him, those men might have gotten away with my things. Officer Daniels nodded, his gaze switching from Mrs. Agnes onto Rex. We'd love to hear about what happened. Take us through it step by step, would you? Mrs. Agnes led them into the living room, where they all sat down. Rex lay at her feet, his eyes still darting at every small sound, his instincts as sharp as ever. Mrs. Agnes now recounted the events, how two men broke in, the jewelry box, and how Rex managed to lunge at them just in time. The officers took notes, and once in a while glanced at each other, their faces showing amazement at Rex's actions. So you say this dog is a rescue? Officer Reyes asked, raising an eyebrow. Mrs. Agnes nodded. Yes, I adopted him a few months ago. He was at the shelter, and they said he needed a good home. I had no idea he used to be a police dog until today. It all makes sense now, though. Officer Daniels smiled. Well, it's not every day you hear about a retired K-9 ending up in a rescue center. Sounds like he's still got what it takes. Rex perked up at the sound of Officer Daniels' voice, and the officer reached down, giving him a scratch behind the ears. You're a good boy, aren't you? Saved the day. Rex let out a little wag of his tail, and Mrs. Agnes was beaming with pride. He really did. I don't know what I would have done without him. Officer Reyes looked up from her notes. Do you think you could give us a description of the two men? We might be able to track them down. Mrs. Agnes nodded, frowning as her mind worked backward. One was tall, with dark hair, and the other was shorter, more stocky. They were both in dark clothes, and they seemed jumpy like cats. They were more scared of Rex than they were of me, I think. Officer Daniels chuckled. I can see why. We'll do our best to find them, ma'am. In the meantime, we'll have a patrol car swing by every so often, just to make sure everything's all right. Mrs. Agnes smiled gratefully. I appreciate that, officers. Thank you. As the officers finished up their notes and were getting ready to go, Officer Reyes turned to Mrs. Agnes. You know, if Rex ever wants to come back to the force, I'm sure we could find a place for him. A dog like that, he's got a lot of heart. Mrs. Agnes chuckled and shook her head. Oh, I think he's quite happy here with me. Besides, I don't think I could bear to part with him now. Officer Reyes smiled. I understand. He's lucky to have found you. After the officers had gone, Mrs. Agnes shut the door securely. She looked down at Rex, still patiently sitting by her side. Well, that went well, didn't it? Now, how about that bone I promise you? Rex's ears perked up, and he followed Mrs. Agnes eagerly to the kitchen. She opened a cabinet and pulled out a large bone, handing it to Rex with a smile. Here you go, hero. You've earned it. Rex took the bone gently from her hand, his tail wagging furiously as he trotted over to his favorite spot by the window. He lay down, gnawing contentedly, his eyes half closed in satisfaction. Mrs. Agnes watched him for a moment, as her heart swelled with affection. She had always loved animals, but Rex was something special. He wasn't a pet, he was her protector, her friend, and it would now seem, her hero. She would have never thought that adopting a rescue dog could bring such exciting things into her life, but she wouldn't trade Rex for anything in the world. Later that night, Mrs. Agnes sat in her comfortable armchair and knitted a scarf, with Rex lying beside her. It had been a night of happenings, and she felt grateful. Rex, the officers, and all that had happened wasn't worse. She leaned towards Rex, who was now lying still, having licked the bone clean, watching her with those brilliant, loyal eyes. You know, Rex, she said softly, her hands pausing in their work, I think you were meant to be here. I think fate brought you to me for a reason. Rex cocked his head slightly, as if listening. His ears twitched at the sound of her voice. Mrs. Agnes smiled and leaned over to pat his head. We make a good team, you and me. And I promise you, I will always take care of you, just like you took care of me today. Rex let out a soft woof. His eyes shone with warmth and loyalty. Mrs. Agnes chuckled, feeling lighter than she had in a very long while. She started knitting again, the soft click of the needles resonating in the silent room as the sun sank below the horizon, casting the house in its warm golden glow. The following day, word had spread around the neighborhood regarding Rex's heroic actions. Mrs. Agnes received more visitors than usual, neighbors checking on her and wanting to meet the dog who foiled the would-be burglars. Little Timmy from next door came over with his mother, his wide eyes looking up at Rex in awe. Is this the dog that scared away the bad guys? Timmy asked with a voice full of wonder. Mrs. Agnes smiled and nodded. Yes, this is Rex. He is quite a brave dog. Timmy tentatively reached out, and ever gentle, Rex sniffed the boy's hand and licked it. Timmy burst into a fit of giggles. He's so cool. I want a dog like Rex someday. His mother smiled, patting Timmy on the shoulder. Maybe one day, sweetheart. But remember, Rex is special. He used to be a police dog, didn't he, Mrs. Agnes? Mrs. Agnes nodded, her eyes beaming with pride. That's right. He's had a lot of training, and he's very smart. But most importantly, he's got a big heart. Timmy looked up at Rex, his admiration apparent. Thank you for protecting Mrs. Agnes, Rex, he said solemnly. Rex barked softly, his tail thumping against the floor. Mrs. Agnes laughed and patted Timmy on the head. He's happy to help, Timmy. That's what makes him such a good boy. As days went on, it seemed the neighborhood came together for Mrs. Agnes and Rex. People brought treats for Rex, flowers for Mrs. Agnes, and offers to help her with anything she might need. Almost as if Rex's bravery reminded everybody again of how they should be looking out for one another, being a community. One afternoon, Mrs. Agnes sat on the porch with Rex sitting beside her when she saw a familiar patrol car drive down the street slowly. It pulled up in front of her house and stopped. Officer Reyes got out and waved at Mrs. Agnes. Good afternoon, Mrs. Agnes, she said as she walked up. Just thought I'd stop by and let you know we caught those two men. Mrs. Agnes' eyes widened, and a smile spread across her face. You did? Oh, that's wonderful news. Officer Reyes nodded, her face serious but pleased. They won't be bothering anyone else for a long time. I just wanted to thank you, and Rex, again for your help. You really made a difference. Mrs. Agnes looked down at Rex, her heart swelling with pride. Well, it was mostly Rex. He's the real hero. Officer Reyes smiled, reaching down to give Rex a pat on the head. That he is. Take care, Mrs. Agnes. And if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to call. Mrs. Agnes watched as Officer Reyes got back into her car and drove away with her heart full of emotion. She looked down at Rex, who stared up at her with those unblinking, faithful eyes. Well, my friend, she said out loud in a hushed tone, it looks like we did some good. And I have a feeling this isn't the last time we'll have an adventure together. Rex let out a soft woof. His tail began to wag in soft motion. Mrs. Agnes smiled, feeling light of heart as she reached down to scratch behind his ears. Together they sat on the porch, watching the world go by, content in the knowledge that they had found in each other exactly what they needed, a true companion, a loyal friend, and a partner for whatever adventures lay ahead. A few weeks had passed since the break-in, and life in the neighborhood was settling back into its comforting rhythm. Mrs. Agnes had returned to her routine, tending to her garden, visiting the local market, and spending her evenings knitting by the window while Rex stood watch. It was a quiet life, but a fulfilling one, especially now with Rex. One morning, Mrs. Agnes decided to take Rex out for a stroll to the park. The day was bright and clear, the kind of day that made you want to be outside. As they walked down the street, Rex trotted along happily beside her, his leash slack as he took in all the sights and smells of the neighborhood. Mrs. Agnes smiled, greeting neighbors as they passed by, many of whom stopped to give Rex a pat on the head or a word of praise regarding his recent heroics. When they reached the park, Mrs. Agnes settled into a shady area beneath a big oak tree and made her way to a bench to sit down. Rex lay down at her feet, his eyes scanning the area in a steady circle as children played nearby and joggers made their way along the pathways. Mrs. Agnes rummaged through her bag, extracted a book, and prepared to read while Rex would enjoy the fresh air. A few minutes later, Mrs. Agnes saw a man standing near the edge of the park. This man darted his eyes everywhere, as if looking for someone. He seemed out of place, in that his clothes were rumpled and his expression tense. Mrs. Agnes tried to ignore him by focusing on her book, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Rex too had caught the man's image, and his ears had perked up while his eyes narrowed on him. In an instant, the man started to cross the street towards some children playing with a ball. The deliberateness in his steps, his gaze fixed on one of them, a little girl with pigtails who was straying farther from the others, made Mrs. Agnes' heart quiver. She looked down at Rex, who already stood up, his body taut, staring at the man. Mrs. Agnes didn't hesitate to let her book fall and rise to her feet. "Rex, stay close," she instructed him, being calm yet firm in her tone. They moved forward toward the children, Mrs. Agnes not taking her eyes off the man. As they drew closer, he was reaching out to the little girl, almost to her shoulder. "Excuse me," Mrs. Agnes called out, clear and loud. The man froze, his head whipping around to look at her. Rex let out a low growl. His stance turned protective, and he stepped slightly in front of Mrs. Agnes while his eyes locked on the stranger. The little girl turned, her eyes widening in confusion at the sight of the man standing so close to her. Mrs. Agnes stepped forward, her expression stern. "Is there something I can help you with?" she asked as steadily as she could manage. The man hesitated, his eyes darting between Mrs. Agnes, Rex, and the little girl. For a moment, he seemed to consider his options, but then he forced a smile, taking a step back. "Oh, no, ma'am. I thought she was someone I knew," he stammered, his voice shaking. Mrs. Agnes merely raised an eyebrow, her gaze steady. "Well, I think it's time you moved along," she said, her voice carrying a weight of finality behind it. Rex growled again, showing just enough teeth to give the man cause for second thoughts about sticking around. The man swallowed hard, nodding quickly. "Yeah, sure. No problem," he mumbled, turning on his heel and walking away, his pace brisk as he disappeared down the path. Mrs. Agnes watched him go, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked down at Rex, who was still standing alert, his eyes following the man till he was out of sight. The girl, oblivious to what had almost occurred, gazed up at Mrs. Agnes with a backward smile. "Your dog is huge," she said, almost in awe. Mrs. Agnes smiled, her heart swelling with pride and relief. "Yes, he is. And he's very good at keeping people safe," she said, reaching down to pat Rex's head. Rex let out a soft huff, his body relaxing now that the danger had passed. Her mother, who was standing a short distance away chatting with another parent, came running over. Her eyes were wide with concern. "Is everything all right?" she asked, looking from Mrs. Agnes to her daughter. Mrs. Agnes nodded, giving the woman a reassuring smile. "Everything's fine now. Just keep an eye on your little one." There was a man who seemed a bit too interested in her. The mother's face went white, and she quickly pulled her daughter close, her eyes welling up with thanks. "Thank you so much. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't been here." Mrs. Agnes shook her head, looking at Rex now, who was calmly sitting at her side. It was Rex here that noticed first. He's got a good sense for these things. She dropped to her knees, gazing at Rex through watery eyes. "Thank you, Rex," she whispered tremulously. He nuzzled closer, his tongue giving a soft lick of her hand. His brown eyes shone with understanding and warmth. After the mother and daughter had caught up with the group again, Mrs. Agnes let out a deep breath, her hands shaking slightly as she sat down on the bench once more. She leaned down, running her fingers through Rex's fur. Her heart swelled with gratitude for the loyal companion standing at her side. You really are something special, aren't you, boy? She said in a hushed tone, choked with emotion. Rex looked up at her, his eyes brimming with loyalty and love, his tail thumping in slow motion against the ground. As the afternoon wore on, Mrs. Agnes couldn't help but think about how much Rex had changed her life. He wasn't just a pet but a protector, a guardian who seemed to know when he was needed most. She always had believed things happened for a reason, and now more than ever, she did believe Rex came into her life for a purpose. As they finally returned home, Mrs. Agnes made sure to give Rex an extra treat, for her heart still raced with all that happened today. She watched him settle down with his bone, his eyes half closed in contentment. She could not think of her life without him anymore. He had become her partner, friend, and hero. That evening, with the sun well below the horizon, Mrs. Agnes got a call from Officer Reyes, checking in on her and Rex. "I heard what happened in the park today," said Officer Reyes, with a very concerned tone. "Is everything okay?" Mrs. Agnes smiled as she glanced over at Rex, who lay sleeping by the window. "We're okay, thanks to Rex. He really is an amazing dog." Officer Reyes chuckled. "Sounds like he's still got those instincts. You know, Mrs. Agnes, if you're ever interested, we could arrange for Rex to get some additional training just to keep those skills sharp. It might be a good idea, considering everything that's happened." Mrs. Agnes drummed her fingers lightly on the armrest of her chair as she considered the offer. "You know, that might not be a bad idea. I want to make sure Rex is always ready, just in case." Officer Reyes' voice lit up. "Great. We'll see about it and let you know what we can set up. He's already a hero, but a bit of extra training never hurts." After the call was over, Mrs. Agnes turned to Rex, her heart filled with warmth. She got up and knelt beside him, stroking his fur gently. "How would you like a bit more training, boy? I think it could be fun just you and me, learning some new tricks." One eye open, Rex's tail gave a slow wag. Mrs. Agnes chuckled, leaned down, and pressed a kiss to his head. "We'll always be a team, won't we, Rex? No matter what." Rex let out a satisfied sigh, his eyes closing once more as he relaxed into her touch. Mrs. Agnes smiled, her heart light. She knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she and Rex would face them together, two unlikely heroes finding each other when they needed it most. The days following were filled with an air of rejuvenated purpose. Mrs. Agnes and Rex started training at the community center, arranged for by Officer Reyes with a retired K-9 trainer. A grizzled man named Frank had spent years working with police dogs and immediately recognized Rex's potential. "This dog is something special," Frank said during their first session, his eyes studying Rex with admiration. "He's got the instincts, the discipline, it's all still there. We just need to bring it back to the surface." Mrs. Agnes watched as Frank put Rex through his paces, tracking scents, responding to commands, even protective maneuvers. Rex took to the training with ease, his eyes shining bright with excitement as he recollected some of the old skills he had already mastered. Mrs. Agnes couldn't help but feel a small swell of pride as she watched her loyal companion in action, his focus and determination evident in every move. After every session, Frank would give Mrs. Agnes advice on how she could work with Rex outside the training sessions. "He has a lot of heart," Frank said one afternoon as they finished up. "And so do you, ma'am. The two of you really have something special going on there, and that is what makes all the difference. Stick with it, and you will have one hell of a partner." Mrs. Agnes smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, Frank. I never thought I would do anything like this, but Rex has changed my life. I want to make sure I'm always ready to protect him just like he protects me." Frank nodded, giving Rex a pat on the head. "You've got a good one here. Just keep trusting each other, that's the key." As Mrs. Agnes and Rex walked home from their training sessions together, she could not help but feel that this was an empowering experience for her. She was a pretty independent lady, but having Rex by her side gave her a different kind of strength altogether. Together, they were learning and growing into a team that could face whatever challenges lay ahead. One evening, after one of the better training sessions, Mrs. Agnes sat on the porch with Rex, the two of them watching the sun set over the neighborhood. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, with a gentle breeze that rustled the leaves of trees. Mrs. Agnes reached down, scratching behind Rex's ears, her heart filled with contentment. "You know, Rex," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "I used to think that getting older meant slowing down, that life would just get quieter. But you've shown me that there's still so much to do, so much to experience. You've brought excitement back into my life, and I can't thank you enough for that." Rex looked up at her, his eyes filled with warmth and understanding. He leaned into her touch, his tail thumping in slow motion against the porch. Mrs. Agnes smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek as she realized just how much this incredible dog had given her, not just protection, but companionship, adventure, and a renewed sense of purpose. Together, they watched the sun dip below the horizon, the promise of more adventures to come lingering in the air. And as the stars began to twinkle above, Mrs. Agnes knew that with Rex by her side, she was ready for whatever lay ahead.